and welcome to Encounters. My guest today is Professor Vernon Cronen. Welcome. And he must have started at this university, University of Massachusetts, about the time that I started my college education.
Oh, that makes me sound really, really old.
Yeah, although it's also a matter of phasing in and phasing out, I guess. But yeah, it can't be denied that you have been teaching at the University of Massachusetts for the past 40 years, right?
Almost. This will be the 40th year. Yeah.
Right.
Started in '70.
So it's quite an achievement, I would say.
It's endurance, anyway.
Yes. So can you give us a bit of an idea of what it was in those days and what it has become since?
Well, one of the fascinating things about coming to UMass at that time was that I was part of, you might say, the second wave of hiring that transformed it from a small college to what was intended to become a university, originally intended to compete with the Big Ten.
Right.
And they hired a lot of people, a lot of us from the Big Ten, some like myself who were new and others who had more experience. I hired a lot of people.
You're coming from
fast.
Illinois, right?
I came from the University of Illinois. There were two other people who were senior, actually three who would come from the University of Illinois. And that was true of most departments. They were massively increasing the size of the faculty and massively increasing the size of the student body,
Right.
and trying to come up with an administrative apparatus that had some connection to the changes.
So in those days it was more small key, low budget, close contact between students and
not
teachers?
Really. It was they increased the enrollment dramatically and fast. I believe, I could be wrong about this figure, but in about 63, 64, it was under 10,000. And by 70, it was 20,000.
Wow, that's a change.
And then quickly the next year went to 21,000. So it was close to the present size when I got there. What was interesting was trying to make some administrative organizational sense of this dramatic increase. Very different kind of student. Still with a reputation of, I shouldn't even use the word in public, but they used to call it ZooMass. I know you've heard that term.
Yes, yeah.
They took a lot of students who I think should never have been in college, who did some really wild things, and of course gave an opportunity to a lot of really excellent students who wouldn't have had an opportunity at a...
So you had a variety of all of them?
Oh, the range was unbelievable in every class. The range from people who had no idea what was going on there to just superb students.
And it was then, but also now?
The range is still pretty large, as it is with any university like this, where you're going to take a chance on some people, and I think that's a good thing. But the range was much greater then than it is now.
It has become more focused and professionalized, I guess.
The reputation has changed. The old idea, why in the world would you go to UMass if you could go to someplace else? That's finally dissipating. Notion that if you're at UMass, must be because mommy and daddy don't make much money or because you couldn't get in someplace better. That stigma is finally going away. But it's
also because the disciplines or some programs have improved and have become recognized outside, I guess.
In the sciences, we've had Nobel Prize winners. We've got other people who are going to be like that, and the reputations of various parts of the university have now become world-renowned.
Right.
So it's quite a change from those early days of, are we going to really make it as a university?
Right. And does it also apply to the changes which took place within communication and for communication students?
Communication's changed a good deal, and so has the communication discipline. When I came, it was dominantly a rhetoric department, meaning the classical tradition, criticism of public speaking.
Right.
There was a small mass media unit. Unlike more developed departments, when I came, I was part of the first group of folks who knew a statistic from wallpaper. That had to be built from nothing. And there was a good deal of suspicion on the part of some people about you number crunchers, which I have ceased to be, but in my early career, we're suspicious of folks like you.
Yeah, that has always been my image of American academe, very much focused on numbers and quantitative approaches.
Yeah, well, the notion was to get a balance. And I think some good things came along. But it was a very, very different department. I mean, now with a major focus on cultural studies in the department, there was no such thing in communication back then. In fact, there really wasn't anything called interpersonal communication, except for these sort of humanistic books on kind of a touchy-feely, I'm okay, you're okay, that sort of not very academic stuff.
More applied.
It wasn't just applied, it was very much feel-good.
Okay.
70s feel-good making its way into academe. There really wasn't much yet of an academic focus on face-to-face interaction, and then very quickly that focus split into a qualitative and a quantitative approach. So all that went on in the national scene in communication, in my side of the department anyway, and also was paralleled, of course, in the local scene.
Yeah, now it has been has developed in other kind of branches and perspectives, I guess.
Oh yes.
But okay, your contribution has always been, as it is known to students, interpersonal communication. I know, and we will go into there in a minute. But how do you look at interpersonal communication? What have you been trying to
communicate with that?
Yeah, to teach your students?
I don't want to jump the gun on the progression of development of where we're trying to go, but the theory with which I've been associated since '75 that developed, actually the terms were first created by W. Barnett Pierce, who came to UMass in '75, called Coordinated Management of Meaning. And if you ask me what is communication, my answer would be it's the coordinated management of meaning. Management including the idea of the creation of meaning inside the process. So what I see, the focus of what I do as being, is the development of ways to understand this very basic process that we're doing right here of two people trying to muddle their way or successfully and brilliantly make their way to creating a conversation in which ideas get made and developed and extended.
Right. And one of the interesting things in the book you co-authored with Pierce, it was published in 1970, right?
80.
Oh, 80, sorry.
Yeah.
Communication and Action and Meaning, the creation of social relations, right? One of the concepts you start with, in a way, is wandering, and I found that a fascinating kind of concept or word to use to introduce the topic of communication and action and meaning. Can you explain?
Yeah, and I have to say, Barnett had to kind of drag me kicking and screaming to the realization of how important that idea was. But the notion is bound up with our conception that there is something wondrous about the moment of social interaction, because meaning, and this is an idea we take from both John Dewey and the later work of Wittgenstein for those who read those sorts of things, but the crucial idea is that meaning is not just about the past and the present. It always has a projection into the future. It is never finished. And so every time one acts, there should be a sense of wonder as what in the world are we doing here? What could come out of this? What are the myriads of possibilities we're creating and sealing off in each of those moments?
Yeah, and wandering in all kind of directions, good and bad, positive, negative, but also some things which sometimes it comes and it goes and it accumulates, but also it may lead to other kind of options, right?
Absolutely. One of the things I have found since the earliest days of working with this is that it's crucial, if you're looking at communication, to retain a focus on time as well as complexity. This happens, and then what does that open up in all sorts of ways that are both ways that you can talk about explicitly and ways that in action and in words you have to show more than you can explain. And that there is a complexity to that that's wonderful, and what kinds of possibilities it opens, and also can be terrifying in terms of what we can do to each other in restricting our possibilities.
Yeah, but one other thing which you highlight quite forcefully in the book and in some of your writings is that you don't really aim for mutual understanding because you don't believe that that's possible, right?
Well, yeah. What we don't think is that mutual understanding is somehow the singular object of communication. If you take the notion that meaning is always to some degree, even if it's a very small degree, in process, well then what does that actually mean? To understand, I like John Dewey's words about that, is to come into agreement in action. There are times when to have a pretty good idea of what the other expects and to meet that expectation is extremely useful. I know once I was presenting this material, I can't remember where, I think it was in Calgary, Canada, and somebody in the audience who had had lunch with me said, "You take these little pills, I bet you hope that when folks are working in that factory that makes those little pills, they're pretty precise and they know pretty darn well what they're supposed to do."
Yeah.
And I would agree with that completely. I think there are times when aiming to meet expectations is very important. Other times when it's not. I just don't want to universalize any standard like that. I was much taken by a book written by the late Paul Václavic, crucial member of the Mental Research Institute, California. And a little book called How Real is Real starts with a chapter, The Benefits of Confusion. And I love to start students out with that. And at first they go, what? And then when you put them in groups and they think, well, wait a minute. When you get confused, you have to think in some different ways to get yourself out.
Right.
And somebody else will say, you know, there was a time I was really confused. I came up with something new. I said, nah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
You can't universalize the notion of confusion as good either.
I normally use the concept of chaos for that purpose, not in a philosophical sense, but in the sense that, you have to look at society and activities human beings are involved in a more chaotic way, rather than that there is a direction and a rationale, which you're also having your problems with, right?
Yeah.
One other thing, Professor Cronen, which you highlight is that you want to start from a pragmatist perspective, and that's not objectivist nor relativist. So what is it? It's realist, you say, but what does it really mean?
Yeah, by realist, we agree with people like James and Dewey and Mead that there is a real world. We don't think that the stories we create have nothing to do, or their success has nothing to do with the fact that wherever you go on the planet, nobody does this.
Right.
Unless helium or something like that. On the other hand, there's no such thing as knowledge untouched by human minds, which I think was the goal of the objectivists. So what does that leave us? And both James and Dewey use the same metaphor. They said, think about knowing something about a simple matter like a chair. The chair has a history. Somebody built it. They built it under particular conditions with a history. The chair has a history of use in a culture. And along you come with your experiences of chairs, and at some point you meet. Now, your understanding of that chair is not going to be fully determined either by the material makeup of that chair, nor will it be fully determined by your experiences. It's a matter of the meeting and what can come out of that that's productive and useful.
Right.
So that's what we're talking about when we say it's neither fully objectivist and it's not fully relativist either. Who was the cartoon? Linus used to say in the old Peanuts strip, no matter how hard you try, you can't bounce a potato chip.
I haven't heard that yet, but that's very true. But that also means that, as you argue, that communication is really at the center of everything. It's at the center of of all these meetings, right?
Right. That's something that I find very hard to teach. Well, it depends on the student, of course, but generally it's a tough thing to teach because we usually come into the study of communication with the notion that we have things in us that we communicate.
Right.
That's problematic to start with. I think all experience is created in the joint action with others, because what I'm saying to you and what you say to me isn't just out of our heads, of course. We have to somehow respond in a way that's partially formed by what the other one of us have said, that we have to act into.
Right.
And so any ideas we have to come out of the interaction. And that's sort of our starting place.
Yes, right. But if I may add one thing, and I'm sure that you're not against that concept, it has to be contextualized as well. We are not starting as empty vessels, so to speak.
Well, of course, we have histories. We're born into cultures.
Right.
But we also take very seriously the idea that context should not be considered a kind of a frame that's just there. And I know in your work you don't treat it that way. You're very attentive to the reflexive side of this, that we make the context. We have to sustain that context. So if I'm working on a situation and someone says, well, here is the situation, my first thought is, what keeps that situation in place? Why doesn't it change? I'm as interested in why things don't change, and being interested in national development issues, I know that's forefront for your work. You've got to be as interested in what keeps things from changing as you are in what makes them change. So we always see context as creation. And to answer your big question, that means that you take communication, if you take a coordinated management and meaning approach, as the central social process. That ways of thinking are created inside communication. We don't think and communicate.
Right.
Our ways of thinking, our ways of feeling, the construction socially of the kinds of emotions we have, the way we create cultural institutions, all of that, to us, is a secondary process created inside the primary one of communication.
Right. You have been working in a very applied way with all your methodologies and concepts. Could you give us an example? I know that family therapy was one of the venues.
We were very fortunate, and quite by accident, that people in systemic family therapy were interested in what I thought was the most esoteric thing I had ever written in my life. And when I look at it now, I think it's so horribly overwritten, it probably qualifies, which was an approach to looking at paradox in families. And we were virtually put together with the family therapists almost by force. We did a presentation, Barnett and Pierce and I, and during a break, a man who is still director of the family unit at University of Calgary drags someone else in the audience up onto the stage along with his colleague and puts us together and says, the four of you must work together. I know that. You are having lunch together and see if I'm right. And by God, was he right? So that gave us
Was that what you could call a coordinated management?
in management of a forcible lunch. But yeah, so to give an example of that sort of thing, what we offer with CMM is first an approach that's very consistent with a family systems point of view that also comes out of Wittgenstein and pragmatism systems. And what we offer is a way of analyzing microprocesses.
Right.
It's not all we do, but that's one thing we can do. to look in detail at how does an episode work. And there's the time idea. Working with therapists, as I have been the last 25 years, they do workshops and they bring in cases and go over the cases. Things that look a mess, what in the world is going on here, can suddenly start to make sense if you just do the simple thing of what happens, what's the response, then what happened, then what happened. Then go back and look for what are the stories that were being created. What is the force, we call it the logical force of a particular utterance in terms of what another brings to the situation? How constrained is that response? So we'll look in detail at situations in families where I'm not a therapist, where I can be more hands-on directly, in organizations, the same sort of thing. We like to look at the detail of how do conversations go and try to get rid of, well, what some organizational consultants do, which is to say, here's my program. These are the steps of good management or good communication. Right. I'd say, no such thing. I want to look and see what happens.
But you leave the solution or the answer up to the people involved, right?
Pretty much. Yeah. I want to guide it so that I see stuck points, a term I take from the family therapists, actually. And see what they can come up with, to see what changes can be produced.
Right. So not necessarily always a change for the better or a change.
Well, sometimes people come back and you know, oh God, I wish I hadn't asked those things. It's worse now than it was when I started.
Right.
And then you better think through what went wrong. It's why one of the things CMM does is offer a way to take your data and organize it into what we call a systemic hypothesis, an account of how the logic of the conversation connects people. And again, taking a page from the family therapists, we learn quickly, not a good idea to create one of those. Do one, put it aside, take your same data and see if you can model it another way, so that you always have an alternative perspective to guide your interviewing when the way you had hitched your star onto is taking you into a black hole along with the people you were trying to help.
But you are, together with your colleague Piers, ambitious enough to call it a methodology, right? It's a way to, a technique in a way to steer, to organize something which has an outcome. Now I've read some of the project results and the articles you wrote about this. I think it's very interesting also at the level of the finesse, the detail of what you're trying to do. But there is of course one thing which you don't want to touch upon, and you, I think for good reasons, but they may also be the blocking elements for to take this further. That's the circumstantial situation in which the partners or the people involved find themselves. How can you modify, or how can you adjust that, I would say?
Yeah. The term that the systemic folks use is the system in view. And Dewey has a similar kind of line, I've forgotten exactly what it is, and it's how much of the system do you have to look at to understand what's going on?
Right.
And you can be wrong when you begin. As with a family, I've seen cases where I've worked with the therapists in which they start with a nuclear family and decide, well, the brother is off to college and is so independent of this, we don't need him. But mother talks to a neighbor constantly. And the neighbor is part of this system. So we've got to enlarge it that way.
Right.
But then you can go, and I know what you're heading toward, these more macrocosmic sorts of notions, like discourses about matters such as at the organization, who are we as an organization?
Right.
And larger than that, social understandings of gender, of race, of ethnicity, of progress. Our concern there is that these become interesting when those ideas are embedded into the discourses people are using. Now, how much does that get the system stuck that you can't change things in the micro as long as there are some kinds of macro functions going on? My usual feeling about that is, yeah, there are some things you don't change very readily with this micro approach.
Yeah, but
there may be some leeway that you miss if you start the other way around. We never start with who's good, who's bad. Or as the therapists say, who's mad, who's bad.
Yeah, you prefer not to take sides.
It's not only we don't want to take sides. You may be suspicious that there is some kind of highly gendered idea going on in an organization. And you hear hints of that. And you don't want to ignore it, but you don't want to jump all over it and find that that's not the major thing going on here, or there are different ways to read it. I remember working with a police department some years ago and getting into this issue the chief was trying to hire more female officers. And the women always used the gendered terms, brother officers. And we talked to them a little bit on the side, and one of the things that happened when I said, how do you feel about the use of that term? When does it come up? How do you use it? And one said, don't touch it. We have found a way of working. We will call ourselves brother officers. They will call us brother officers. And for now, this is working. Our problem here is not a gender problem. It's a different problem that surrounds it.
And it stayed that way?
Yeah, that was not their issue at all. The issue was one of the chief wanting a different form of policing and wanting to, in a way, skip the echelon of his sergeants and lieutenants who were bought into an older way of working and trying to work directly with the junior folks. Now, the junior folks were a mix, much more than before, of Latino, black, female. But the issue wasn't so much that. It was where is the authority of the sergeant and the lieutenant vis-a-vis the chief. And if you just zeroed in on these issues of race and identity, I'm not saying they played no role. They did play some role. But you'd miss the bigger picture of trying to transform or resist a different approach to policing.
Right.
That was all intertwined with
I can understand and I see that. It was Howard Zinn, at least in my readings, who mentioned that word as the forgotten word in American history and in American discourse. That's race. Well, now we are in a period that the issue by certain standards and certain people has become an open one for discussion with a black American, an African American president, etc. But it also can be used as a cover to hide other things.
Surely.
And I think that your approach is very important in that sense, that it really digs deep to understand the inner aspects of issues.
I want to know where is the discourse of race being used in an institution, and what are the details of it?
Right.
I don't want to assume I know them. I want to try to explore with the way in which we interview, what's the grammar of race? In Wittgenstein's notion of grammar, that is, how do you put together sentences with that word?
Right.
How do people respond to them? What's the logic and logical force that's created when those terms are used? And can some of those stories be changed at a larger institutional level? When you can use this, and Barnett Pierce has done more of the larger institutional work with this than I have, of gathering people together in larger institutions and trying to work through what are the different stories that are at play as contexts in different parts of this organization. What's the logic of them? And then, of course, what keeps them going?
Right.
What conversations do they drive? How do those conversations turn back and reinstantiate and possibly change the way in which those larger discourses go.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the way you put it, and I thank you for your thoughtful comments. I wish you all the best for the
Thank
future.
you.
And I thank you for your interest.
Thank you.